Okay, so today we're going to finish up the last little bit of chapter 16. We've covered the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. We've covered, I think we got through all of the American Revolution. And then today we're going to talk about the French Revolution, and that'll be it for chapter 16. Just a reminder, last week's Blackboard quiz is still open. It closes at the end of today, so be sure to get that done. And then the one for this week, I've already got it made, and I just have to deploy it to put it out there. So it'll be up this afternoon, and it'll be due on Sunday like normal. So we'll get back to the normal schedule. So the one from last week is still open. Be sure to get that done, and then there will be a new one this afternoon, back on the normal schedule, that will cover the last bit of chapter 16 here, the French Revolution, and then it'll cover the first part of chapter 17, which we'll cover on Thursday, which is on the Industrial Revolution. Okay, any questions about that? All right. Your grades on Blackboard should be pretty much up to date. Um, I put in the first exam last week. Now, if you look on Blackboard, it is split into two different grade columns. So it says like test one, part one, and test one, part two. So it's not a bad idea to go back and double check your grades every so often. If you made a 93, but I keyed in a 39 by accident, that's going to have an impact on your grade, right? So it's not a bad idea to double check. Log into Blackboard every so often. Make sure your grade looks like what you think it's supposed to look like. And if you think there's a problem, be sure and let me know. It is your adjusted score. Remember, I gave everyone bonus points on the first test. So you could even go above 100. If you made an 89 without the bonus, you could potentially have a 109. It's those two columns added together. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay. Well, let's talk about chapter 16. Let's finish this up. And like I say, I think we got through the American Revolution. Did we talk about all this stuff last week? I can't remember. All right, so just to review, just very briefly, we started off chapter 16 talking about the scientific revolution and all these advancements in science, but specifically in physics and in astronomy. And people got to thinking and said, well, if we can use, this new scientific method, if we can use these new techniques to discover all these things about the planets and the natural world we live in and all that good stuff, what would happen if we applied those same techniques to everyday life? What if we applied them to human interaction? And that's where the Enlightenment really comes from. The idea, well, what if we, used these techniques to study the way the humans interacted, and maybe just like the motion of the planets are governed by natural laws, maybe human interaction can be, measured by natural laws as well. So that led into the Enlightenment, the use of logic and reason in everyday life, and that's what led into the American Revolution. We spoke specifically about two philosophers. Remember, we spoke about Thomas Hobbes and his idea of the social contract. We spoke about John Locke and his idea of natural rights, and how those, among other things, consent of the governed, representative government, all those sort of Enlightenment ideals sort of led into the American Revolution. And we just spent a few minutes talking about the American Revolution. And then today, now we're getting into the French Revolution. Because just like the American Revolution was a direct result of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution is a direct result of the American Revolution. Almost a direct result. They're very closely linked. They're very closely linked. Now, we've mentioned France several times at this point in this class. Remember that France was a pretty good example of an absolutist monarchy. That is, the King of France was pretty much the authority in France. And so the Enlightenment principles that we've spoken about, representative government, consent of the governed, the idea of natural rights, all of those things are going to play a role in the French Revolution as well. And in fact, you could even make the argument that they're going to play a bigger role because France didn't have those things to begin with. England had some of those rights. Remember, England called itself the most free nation on earth. And so it's coming from a different place than England was. It's coming from an absolutist monarchy. It's coming from a government where people don't have many rights. And maybe because of that, the French Revolution is going to be way more radical than the American Revolution. Way more radical. And again, that's probably because it's coming from a different place. The English government and the American colonies, by extension, already had some idea of this idea of representative government. They already had this idea of, at least some rights. The English citizens at least had some rights, if they weren't nearly the rights that we have today. So it wasn't as far a leap for them. But France was coming from a completely different system. And because of that, the result of it will be much more radical. France was being governed under what was known as the ancient regime, the Ancien regime. Things hadn't changed in France for hundreds of years. This form of government had been going on for a very long time. Now, I said that France was an absolutist monarchy, and it was. But they did have a form of representative government. It was known as the Three Orders or the Three Estates. You'll also see it as the Estates General. The Estates General. The three things that all mean the same thing. The Three Estates, the Three Orders, or the Estates General. And the Three Estates, as you might expect, was made up of three different parts. You have the First Estate. The First Estate was known as those that pray. First Estate, those that pray. That was their job. And of course, that's the church. That's members of the clergy. First Estate, the clergy, the church, those that pray. Second Estate, those that fight. It was their job to run the wars. That was the nobility. Second Estate, those that fight, the nobility. And then the Third Estate was anyone else. And this is really where the problem was. The Third Estate was everyone else. If you weren't a member of the clergy, if you were not a member of the nobility, you belonged to the Third Estate. And for a long time, it hadn't been a problem. But as we move into the 1700s and the 1800s, the issue is some of these members of the Third Estate are becoming incredibly wealthy. Now, they're merchants, and so they're not nobility, so they're not part of the Second Estate. They're still part of the Third Estate, which contains everything from the lowliest beggar on the streets up to the very wealthiest merchants. And that's going to be the problem. These wealthy merchants are going to begin resenting the fact that they don't have any political power. And that's one of the main things that will lead into the French Revolution, as we will see in just a few minutes. All right, so we've got the king. The king is the guy in charge. He's an absolutist monarch. But you do have some form of representative government with the Estates General. The Estates General is very similar to the English Parliament in that it's not permanent. It's only called into being when the king calls it into being. It doesn't meet on a regular basis. They only convene when the king calls them into session, and that's important. Now, the French monarchy it's got some problems. We spoke about Louis XIV. Remember, Louis XIV was a very strong king. They called him the Sun King. But he dies. And when he dies, his successor, Louis XV, is just a little kid. I think he's like 5 years old. And so Louis XV isn't able to rule in his own stead for several years. And so he's got all these advisors, and people are taking advantage of him. And he's just a little kid. And so they have very weak leadership for a very long time. The other problem is that Louis XV inherits a lot of debt. He was the Sun King. He the French court was the center of the universe. It was renowned for its wealth and power and grandeur. And if you look at any paintings of Louis XIV, or you take a trip through the French palace, the Palace of Versailles, where the king lived, it was just over the top, ornate. You know, very what's the word I'm looking for? Very glamorous. He spent a lot of money. That's what I'm getting at. Louis the 14th spent lots and lots and lots of money. There were lots of wars during this time. And so he really drove France nearly to the brink of bankruptcy. And so they've got to come up with this money somewhere. Now, one of the things about this, and I'll come back to this, the first and the second estate, the clergy and the nobility, they don't pay taxes. That's one of their perks, is that they don't pay taxes. They've got other perks. The clergy actually have the authority to tax. Now they call it tithing, but you had to pay it. The clergy have the ability to tax. The nobility owns most of the land, and they have other rights as well. But they don't pay taxes. France is so in debt that Louis XV says, well, maybe what if we tried taxing everybody? The nobility and the clergy, they've got most of the wealth of the country, and yet they're not paying any taxes. What if we tried to tax them just a little bit? And immediately, everyone is up in arms, and the clergy and the nobility are shouting at them, you can't do that. It's our right to not pay taxes. It doesn't work out. And so what I'm getting at is, as we move into the 1770s, the French monarchy is in bad shape. Nobody respects his power. Nobody really respects the ideas that he's coming up with to try to save the king. He's got a lot of debt. It's in a bad place. And then in 1774, Louis XV dies, and Louis XVI takes over. So Louis XVI is really walking into a bad situation. He didn't really cause any of it himself. He just inherits this bad situation. And like I say, 1770s, now we've got the American Revolution. And this is actually a pretty big impact on France. I don't know how deep we went into it last week, but France was far and away the most important American ally during the American Revolution, which is a problem for a couple of reasons. Number one, it just adds to the debts because the French are paying troops, they're loaning money to the Americans, which we happen to never pay back. They're doing all these things to help the American Revolution. That's one problem, but that's a relatively minor problem. The bigger problem is that a number of these French soldiers that are serving over in the colonies are exposed to these American ideas of freedom. And so all of these calls for equality and consent of the governed and representative government and, restricted powers of the government, they're absorbing all of these Enlightenment ideas while they're over in the colonies, and they're taking them back with them to France. And so when they get back to France and they look at this absolutist government, and they look at the fact that the Estates General has not been called into session for, I don't know, decades at this point. I mean, it's been an incredibly long time. They're beginning to ask themselves, well, if they did this in the colonies, what would prevent us from doing this over in France? So they're exposed to these American ideas of freedom, of liberty and equality, and they take that back with them when they go home to France. And that's going to have a very big impact on the French Revolution. And so eventually Louis XVI gets in a bind. He is forced to call the Estates General into session. Just like the English Parliament, one of the duties and regulations of the Estates General of the three estates was the ability to tax. And Louis XVI is in trouble. He needs money. He's got to pass new taxes. And so he's forced to call the Estates General into session. And that's going to be a problem. like I said, the Estates General had not been called into session for a very, very long time, so they have to elect all new people. And here's the thing. The Third Estate had by far the most members. Trying to remember the exact numbers, but the Third Estate had more members than First and Second Estate combined. That's what I'm trying to say. The Third Estate had more members than the First and Second Estate combined. So there were many more commoners that came to the Estates General. But they actually had the least influence. Even though they had the most delegates, they had the least influence because the way the system was set up, each estate got one vote. And so the First Estate got one vote, the Second Estate got one vote, and the Third Estate got one vote, regardless of how many delegates they had. And what you might expect happened. The First and Second Estate very often joined up and teamed up on the Third Estate because they teamed up to protect their privileges. And the Third Estate was kind of left out in the cold. And so the members of the Third Estate are pretty upset about this. They've got the most delegates. They represent obviously more members of society because the clergy and the nobility was just a small percent of the population. So the Third Estate represents more people. They've got more people, and yet they have the least influence because the First and the Second Estate always teamed up against them. So they're pretty upset. And then comes this guy. He will be one of the leaders of the French Revolution, one of the early leaders. And it's interesting because he's actually a member of the First Estate. He's a Catholic priest, the Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès was a Catholic priest who wrote, it's not really a book, but a pamphlet entitled, What is the Third Estate? What is the Third Estate? And this put the arguments and the frustrations and the anger of the Third Estate into writing. It condensed it down, it boiled it down. And just to paraphrase one of his quotes from What is the Third Estate? He asks, what is the Third Estate? Everything. What have they been in politics up until now? Nothing. What do they want to be? They want to be something. And it becomes a rallying cry for the Third Estate. And so they decide, listen, we're not going to take it anymore. We're going to do something about this. And so one day, when everybody showed up to the Estates General, it was being held at the Palace of Versailles, which was the big king's palace just outside of Paris. Everybody shows up one day, and the Third Estate says, listen, we're done with this Estates General business. We're creating the National Assembly. We're creating the National Assembly. It's an assembly not of the three estates, but of the people. And they say, listen, First Estate, Second Estate, if you want to join us, that's great. We'd love to have you. But even if you don't, we're going to continue on with our business. We're tired of meeting as the Estates General. It's not fair to us. We're creating this new group, the National Assembly, and it's a meeting of the people, and we would love to have you guys. But even if you don't join us, we're going to continue on. And they swore an oath. It's known as the Oath of the Tennis Court, of all places. The reason it's known as that, Louis XVI got word of this, and he gets very nervous. I mean, obviously, things are moving beyond his control. And he says, I got to put a stop to this. And so he locks the doors and he tells them, you're in an illegal meeting. You've stepped beyond the bounds of your authority. You're not allowed to meet anymore. You can meet as the Estates General, but this National Assembly thing, that's illegal, and you guys are not allowed to meet. And so he locks the doors of the palace. And the only place that's big enough to hold everyone is one of his tennis courts. So they meet outside at this tennis court, and the oath of the tennis court was they promise not to disband without a new constitution. They are going to create a new form of government in France, and they promise not to give up until that happens. So the Third Estate creates the National Assembly, and a few nobles come over, and a few clergy members like CAS come over, but the vast majority of them do not. And so the National Assembly is mostly controlled by commoners, by the non-nobility, non-clergy. And they swear in the oath of the tennis court, let's see, this is June 1789. June of 1789. They swear the oath and they say, we will not give up until we have a new constitution. Now, Louis is really scared. They called his bluff. They didn't just turn around and go home. They continued to meet. And so Louis begins calling in troops from around Paris. He begins calling in soldiers. And word on the street is that if the National Assembly does not give up and go home, they're going to be sent home by force. This is a problem for the National Assembly because they don't have troops of their own. They don't have guards of their own. If the soldiers come at them, there's nothing they can do to protect themselves. And so very early on in the French Revolution, the question is, will the National Assembly survive? What can they do to protect themselves against the king's soldiers? And the answer, as it turns out, it doesn't come from the National Assembly at all. They're actually going to be saved by more of the common people. July 1789. French commoners march on the Bastille. The Bastille was an old fort in Paris. At one point, it had served as a prison, but at that point in time, it was being used as an army. It's a place where the army stored their guns and ammunition. And so the common people of Paris marched on the Bastille. They seized these guns and ammunition, and then they marched to Versailles. And they basically said to the king, if you want to get rid of the National Assembly, if you're going to send troops against the National Assembly, you got to go through us first. And even today, Bastille Day is celebrated. It's kind of like the French 4th of July. It's the day the common people rose up, took arms against the king, and said, you're going to let the National Assembly do their work. You're going to let them create this new constitution. And if you don't, we're going to have words. A month later, they publish, the National Assembly publishes the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And this is basically the French Declaration of Independence. Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And as a matter of fact, Thomas Jefferson was still in France at this time. He had been serving as a diplomat to France for several years. And of course, Thomas Jefferson wrote the American Declaration of Independence. And he will help the Abbé Sieyès and the Marquis de Lafayette, who was a huge figure in the American Revolution. He was one of George Washington's most trusted advisors. So Jefferson will help in the writing of this Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which, like I said, is very similar to the American Declaration of Independence, except it maybe goes a little bit further. It's even more detailed. It talks about the idea of natural rights, of liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression, the idea of the general will, Remember, we spoke about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the idea of the general will, that government ought to do the most good for the most people. It protected freedom of speech. It protected freedom of the press, equality before the law, representative government, popular sovereignty, individual freedoms. All of these Enlightenment ideals. All of these Enlightenment ideals are contained in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And over the next 2 years, the National Assembly does exactly what they said they were going to do. They create a new constitution. And the end result of this is a constitutional monarchy. They still have a king, but now that king's power is limited, just like we saw in Great Britain, right? Just like we saw in the United Kingdom. They have a king, but their king's power was limited by law. Now that exists in France as well, a constitutional monarchy. Well, Louis is not crazy about this. He can see the writing on the wall, and he does not like where this is headed. Now, under this, up until now, he has been a free man. He's been the king. And of course, the National Assembly, they declare their allegiance to the king, but they are going to walk back his powers. Well, in the fall of 1791, Louis decides he's had enough. And so he gets his family together. They all put on disguises, and they try to sneak out of Paris. He's trying to get out of France. He's trying to get to another country where maybe, who knows what he wants to do. Maybe he's going to raise an army and take France back. Maybe he's just going to live in exile for the rest of his days. Who knows? He doesn't get that far. Somebody recognizes him, and he is brought back to Paris, and he's basically placed under arrest. They put him in a palace, and they say, you can't leave. Well, all this time, the rest of Europe is looking at France and wondering what in the world is going on. On the one hand, they're happy that France is being taken down a peg or two, right? France had been the dominant government in Europe for a long time. Remember the court of the Sun King? He was a very powerful monarch, not just in France, but in Europe as a whole. And so everyone's kind of happy to see France maybe not as powerful as they used to be. But on the other hand, right, they're asking themselves, if this could happen in France with as strong a monarchy as France has had, with all that power, with all that tradition, if this could happen in France, what's it to stop from happening in our country? And remember, a lot of these ruling families of Europe, they're all intermarried. And so Louis was their cousin or brother or nephew or whatever. And so the rest of Europe looks at France and they say, you know what, knock it off. If you don't give Louis his freedom back, if you don't put him back on the throne, if you don't knock this off, we're going to have words. And France says, well, then let's just get to it. So 1792, France declares war on Austria and Prussia, starting off a series of wars known as the French Revolutionary Wars. The French Revolutionary Wars. It will be a series of conflicts, basically France against all of Europe. And initially, it does not go well. In fact, it goes very badly. It goes very badly. And this is really the turning point of the French Revolution. Everything up till now has been relatively peaceful. It's been relatively bloodless. Yes, there's been some violence. Some people have lost their lives. But up to now, it's been pretty restrained. The National Assembly created a new constitution, placed limits on the king, and it was accepted by pretty much everyone except the king. But once France enters these revolutionary wars, that's when things really begin to go off the tracks. Louis is arrested. The rest of Europe isn't really sure how to react to this, and things are going to spiral out of control. This guy is Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre. And he is the leader of one of the French, they're called clubs, but really they're political parties. He's the leader of a French political party known as the Jacobins. And the Jacobins are radicals. They want to take this further than it's gone. They don't think enough change has happened. And they want to totally remake French society. And they do. France is leaving the past behind them. And it's not just the Jacobins. A lot of other people buy into this as well. Just to give you an example of some of the changes that they make in French society, one major change that still has ramifications today, they're the ones that developed the metric system, which, if you think about it, the metric system actually makes a lot of sense coming from an Enlightenment perspective, the use of logic and reason. Well, everything in the metric system is the power of 10, right? And so it's much easier to convert things up and to convert them down than it is in, say, the English imperial system, where 12 inches equals a foot and 3 feet equal a yard. That 500 and 5,000 whatever feet equal a mile. None of that makes any sense. Nobody can even remember any of all that. And so it makes much more sense to say 100 centimeters equals a meter and 1,000 meters equals a kilometer and so forth and so on. It's much easier to convert. They changed the calendar. They went from a 12-month calendar to a 10-month calendar. I'm trying to remember exactly how it worked now. It was a 10-month calendar. They changed the days of the week. I mean, like I say, they really went deep into reforming society. They said we're really embracing these Enlightenment principles to an extreme effect. They changed the church. The church became an institution owned by the government, and so it went pretty off the deep end. And then once Robespierre and the Jacobins took power, like I say, it got very extreme. The king was put on trial. He was found guilty and he was put to death along with his wife, Marie Antoinette. And just like the English did in the English Civil War, the French have ended their monarchy. He is no longer, in fact, when he was tried, he was no longer the king. They referred to him as Louis Capet, which was the house kind of that he belonged to. He was put to trial as an average citizen and he was put to death. And this is what kicks off what's known as the Reign of Terror, because once the Jacobins take control, once this very extreme political party takes control, some really bad stuff is going to happen. Secret trials, people are arrested and not charged with anything. People just disappear in the middle of the night. Anyone that the Jacobins thought was a threat to this government, a threat to their power, just disappeared. Tens of thousands of people lost their life. We don't know how many people died. Estimates somewhere 30 to 40,000 people died in the Reign of Terror. And again, one of the reasons we don't know is because people just simply disappeared. And so if you were critical of the government, or if somebody just thought you were critical of the government, maybe you just belonged to a competing political party, that was enough that you were deemed a threat and you could be dealt with. So like I say, it starts off fairly restrained, but it goes much further, the American Revolution. It is much bloodier. It's much more violent. In the American Revolution, it's a political revolution. We create a new government, but we don't try to change the very fabric of society. We didn't try to change everything about society down to the days of the week. The French Revolution goes much further than that. It's a much more radical event. Now, eventually, Robespierre is going to die. He and the other leaders of the Jacobins, that's the problem with paranoia. Eventually, somebody's going to look at you and decide that you're a threat as well. And so Robespierre and his other leaders are going to die violent deaths. And somebody says, that's enough. We've been living like this too far. There's too much death, too much violence. We need to create a new government. And this new government is going to be known as the Directory. The Directory. And this will be a 5-person government. A 5-person council is going to rule France. And it's into all of this chaos. It's into all of this, uncertainty, unsettled times, that one very strong-willed individual is going to be able to take charge, and that's Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte was a French general. His initial claim to fame, interestingly enough, he was the savior of the Directory. He learned of a plot to get rid of the Directory and create yet another new government. And so he marches his troops into Paris and he saves the Directory and he's a hero of the people. And then he just never leaves. He sets up a new government of his own. Technically, he was known as the first consul. In reality, he was depending on who you ask, he was a dictator. He was a military ruler of France. But he named himself Emperor of France. And so you can see France is going through some stuff right now. It starts off after the American Revolution, the 1780s. They have a monarchy, which they've had for hundreds of years. And then very quickly, they cycle through a constitutional monarchy to a republic to back to a monarchy again, all in the span of a couple of decades. This is incredibly tumultuous times. So by 1799, he is in control of France, and he is known as Emperor Napoleon I. All this time, all these years, these French Revolutionary Wars have been continuing on and on and on. And they're still not going super well for France. France has spent a lot of money, a lot of people have been killed. And it's not until Napoleon comes into power that they're really going to turn the tide. Napoleon, of course, is a brilliant military commander. He basically goes to war with all of Europe, yet once again, only this time, France wins. And Bonaparte is actually, probably since the Romans, he is able to unite Europe as much as anyone else has been able to. He conquers a huge chunk of Europe. He conquers a huge chunk of North Africa. And in fact, it looks like Napoleon cannot be stopped. The turning point comes in 1811 when he decides to invade Russia. Don't invade Russia in the winter. It's a bad idea. It doesn't work for anybody. It didn't work for Napoleon, didn't work for Hitler. It only ends in misery and disaster. Russia, as it turns out, is a very big place. It's huge. It's the largest country on the planet. And what happens is he invades Russia without really realizing how big it is. And so his men are very stretched out, and it becomes very hard to get supplies to everybody. They get caught in winter. The Russian winter ain't nothing to mess with. And so he invades Russia. It goes very badly for Napoleon. He turns around and he tries to get out. And from there, it's all downhill. Eventually, he will be defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. He's actually sent to an island. He's supposed to be, banished there for the rest of his life. He actually escapes. He raises yet another army. He goes on another war until he's defeated again. And then he's sent to another island where he dies shortly thereafter. And France has its second republic. All right. And so the French Revolution is over. The monarchy, the emperorship has been abolished. And so France is now in a new republic form of government. But just like the American Revolution, the influences of the American Revolution weren't contained only to America. Same thing with the French Revolution. There are worldwide repercussions, not just the continent-wide wars in Europe. The French Revolution is definitely going to spread beyond the borders of France and even Europe. The first and probably best example is in Haiti. Haiti, before the French Revolution, was a French colony known as Saint Domingue. Haiti, of course, is in the Caribbean. And as a French colony, it had huge numbers of slaves. Huge numbers of slaves. And right around the time that the difficulties in France started, we also see difficulties in the colony of Saint Domingue, which was pretty smart on their part, right? France is preoccupied with other stuff. Now's our chance. So in 1791, violence will break out. A slave uprising is going to take place. 1791, a slave uprising is going to take place. And after years and years and years of fighting, they are eventually successful. And this is actually important because this is the only time that I know of in human history where a slave uprising succeeded. That the slaves were able to throw off the yoke of their masters. And not only did they win freedom for themselves, but they created a brand new country, the country of Haiti. The country of Haiti. We see the same thing in the Spanish colonies in South America. Just like we saw in France, just like we saw maybe to a lesser extent in the American Revolution, there are challenges to the social order. And so again, one of the hallmarks of the Enlightenment was this concept of equality, that people ought to be equal before the law. And so in Mexico, we see a revolt led by men like Miguel de Hidalgo. Mexico will eventually win their independence in 1821. In South America, we see the efforts of men like Simon Bolivar, most notably modern-day Argentina, Venezuela. and the creation of new republics there. And again, all of this is based on Enlightenment principles: consent of the governed, representative government, restricted government, limited government. And it's still not over. I don't have a slide for this, but I want you to write it down. Yeah. I don't have a slide for this, but I want you to write it down. The revolutions of 1848. The revolutions of 1848. Once again, it's France stirring up trouble. So by 1848, the Second Republic is still alive and kicking, and it's actually Napoleon's nephew. His name is Louis Napoleon. Is actually going to take over and crown himself emperor. He's going to be known as Napoleon III. And there's a backlash against this, and we're actually going to see a wave of revolutions sweep through Europe. That's what I want you to remember. 1848, the revolutions of 1848, is a wave of liberal revolutions that sweep through Europe. Revolutions of 1848 is a wave of liberal revolutions that sweep through Europe. Actually going to be important as we move into the later 1800s. Because these revolutions of 1848 are not successful. They're not super successful. They don't last very long. But one of the things we're going to see happen as a result of the revolutions of 1848 is a new political ideology, a new way of thinking about politics. It's a backlash against these liberal revolutions. It's going to be known as conservatism. A new political ideology known as conservatism. And people are going to point to the French Revolution. They're going to point to the revolutions of 1848 and say, listen, liberalism caused these revolutions. Liberalism is violent, it's bloody, it's destructive. Things were working fine the way that they were. Why do we have to go and change everything? Keeping things the way that they've been, the way that we know that they work, is better. Tradition is better. Conservatism. It's created, I mean, it's always been there, but it really comes into focus as a political ideology, as a backlash against the liberalism of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1848. And then one last thing I want to talk about is it's not really an ideology, but it is part of politics, and that's the word nationalism. Now, I don't know if we've really mentioned nationalism before, but nationalism is something that really comes out of the French Revolution. And we've mentioned what a nation was, right? We said that a nation was a group of people with a shared cultural background. Well, nationalism is kind of the offshoot of that. Just like patriotism is devotion to one's country, nationalism is a devotion to one's nation. And that's not always the same thing. But the French Revolution it ran very high on nationalism because they were proud to be French, and they flew the French flag and they sang French national anthems. They were very proud to be French. It was deep nationalism. It was France against the world, and we got to stick together. And again, nationalism as a new political ideology is going to sweep through Europe just like liberalism did. And very often, those two things were tied together in people's minds. Nationalism and liberalism went together because that's, the French Revolution created those things. Nationalism is going to be a very, very powerful force in Europe because Europe is a very diverse place. You've got lots of different groups of people all crammed in together in a very small place. You've got lots of different religions, different languages, different cultures. And so nationalism, this intense devotion to whatever you decided your nation was, whether that was France or Germany or Italy or Spain, nationalism is going to be a very, very powerful force. It's born out of the French Revolution. It's very closely tied to liberalism, but it can be tied to conservatism as well. And all these things, the picture I'm trying to paint for you is as we move into the mid 1800s, things are very unsettled in Europe. You've got revolution after revolution. You're still feeling the after effects of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The English Empire, which for a very long time has sort of been the backbone, it's been the world's largest empire. It's beginning to show its cracks a little bit. It's beginning to start a downward slide. And so as we move out of the 1800s into the 1900s, all of these new political forces, liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, all these new political forces are going to combine in a perfect storm of events that will lead us into some of the largest conflicts the world has ever seen. When we start talking about World War I mean, we're nearly there. World War I is in the early 19 teens. We're 50 years away from it. That's a blink of an eye in world history, right? Um, that's what I'm getting at. All of these forces that we've been talking about, all these ideas, all these competing ideas, is going to lead Europe into a massive conflict. It will eventually engulf the world. And of course, World War I causes World War II. World War II causes the Cold War. So we're talking about easily a half century to a century of conflict and death and destruction because of these things that we've been talking about: conservatism, liberalism, nationalism. And it all goes back to the Enlightenment. It all goes back to the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So this is some pretty big stuff that we're getting into now. Okay, that's all I've got for today. It's a little early, and I know we're behind, but whatever. I'm tired of talking. So when we come back on Thursday, we will pick up with chapter 17, which is the Industrial Revolution. We are getting kind of close to our next test. The next test will cover chapters 16, 17, and 18. So depending on how long it takes us to get through 17 and 18, we'll have our next test after that. So probably at least another week and a half away, but we are coming up on it, just so you're aware. Continue working on your research projects. Finish the quiz from last week if you haven't. Make sure you get that done by tonight, and then I'll put the next quiz up this afternoon. It'll be due Sunday night, and I think that's it. I will see you guys on Thursday.